My friends, I want to tell you about my first Monday morning of retirement, a morning I had anticipated with genuine excitement for years, imagining all the freedom and possibility it would finally bring me. I woke up without an alarm for the first time in over 4 decades, made my coffee slowly, sat down at my kitchen table, and then found myself facing a question that stopped me cold in a way I had never anticipated. I genuinely did not know what I wanted to do with my day. Not because I lacked options, but because I realized, sitting there in the quiet of that first free morning, that I had spent so many decades organizing my entire life around what others needed and expected from me that I had genuinely lost touch with what I myself actually wanted. I want to be honest with you that this realization frightened me considerably more than I expected it to. I had spent 42 years as an engineer, building a career primarily because it would provide well for my family and satisfy my own father's expectations of what a respectable, successful life looked like. I had spent those same decades as a husband and father, making countless decisions based on what my wife and children needed, decisions I made willingly and with genuine love, but decisions that had gradually crowded out any space for genuinely asking what I myself wanted from my own life, separate from what everyone around me required of me. Sitting at that kitchen table that first Monday morning, I began, somewhat uncomfortably, tracing this pattern back through my entire life. I chose my college major because it would please my father. I chose my first job because it offered financial stability for the family I hoped to build. I chose where we lived because it suited my wife's career and my children's schools. Decision after decision, decade after decade, I had made entirely reasonable, often genuinely loving choices, but I had made almost none of them by first honestly asking what I myself actually wanted, separate and apart from what everyone around me needed from me. Retirement, stripping away the daily structure that had always given me an easy answer to what I should be doing each day, finally revealed a truth I had managed to avoid confronting directly for over 60 years. AI prompt, a photorealistic cinematic 16:9 image of an older man sitting at a kitchen table, his eyes lowered as though lost in deep memory, a timeline of life metaphorically suggested by a series of blurred, overlapping reflections in a nearby window, a university building, a suburban house, an office corridor, all softly out of focus, morning light casting a quiet melancholy across the scene. The mood introspective and ruminative, no sharp faces or readable text. Today I want to share with you everything I discovered during the difficult, often disorienting months that followed that first Monday morning, because I believe this particular realization, arriving so often and so sharply at retirement specifically, deserves far more honest examination than most of us ever give it. This is not a lesson about abandoning the people you love or regretting the choices that built your family and your life. It is a lesson about finally, honestly asking what you yourself actually want, perhaps for the very first time in decades, and discovering what becomes possible once you allow yourself to genuinely answer that question. The first thing I understood was that living generously for the people I loved and losing touch with my own desires were not actually the same thing, though I had spent decades treating them as though they were inseparable. I had believed, for most of my adult life, that any genuine desire of my own that conflicted even slightly with what my family needed represented a kind of selfishness I should quietly set aside. I eventually understood that a full, generous life could actually include my own genuine wants alongside my care for others, rather than requiring my own desires to be permanently subordinated beneath everyone else's needs. The second thing I understood was that I could not actually remember, with any real clarity, what genuinely excited or interested me before I had become a husband and father responsible for providing for a family. When I sat down and tried honestly to recall my own authentic interests from my early 20s, before these decades of dutiful decision-making had begun, I found the memory surprisingly hazy, as though this earlier version of myself, the one who had once had genuine, independent preferences, had been quietly buried beneath so many years of responsible, other-centered choices. The third thing I understood was that my own father's expectations, though he had passed away nearly 15 years earlier, were still quietly directing many of my choices even in retirement, long after any practical reason for honoring them had genuinely expired. I discovered, examining my own retirement plans honestly, that I was still unconsciously choosing activities and pursuits that I believed my father would have approved of, rather than ones I genuinely, independently desired for myself, a realization that startled me considerably given how many years had passed since his passing. The fourth thing I understood was that my wife, once I finally discussed this realization honestly with her, admitted to feeling something remarkably similar in her own retirement, having spent decades organizing her own life primarily around our children's and my own needs rather than her own independent desires. This conversation, which I had feared might create distance between us, instead brought us considerably closer, as we discovered together, somewhat to our mutual relief, that we were both navigating an identical rediscovery of long-buried personal desires we had each quietly set aside decades earlier. The fifth thing I understood was that certain hobbies and interests I had abandoned decades earlier, believing them impractical or insufficiently serious for a responsible provider, had never actually disappeared, but had simply been waiting patiently in the background of my life for permission to resurface. A genuine interest in woodworking, set aside in my 20s as an impractical hobby unsuited to a young engineer building a serious career, resurfaced with surprising intensity once I finally gave myself permission to pursue it purely for my own pleasure, without any practical justification required. The sixth thing I understood was that I had spent decades making career decisions almost entirely based on advancement, salary, and stability, rarely if ever pausing to honestly ask whether the actual daily work itself genuinely interested or fulfilled me. Looking back across my entire 42-year career, I recognized that I had optimized almost exclusively for external markers of success and responsible provision, while genuinely enjoying perhaps only a small fraction of my actual daily working life. A realization that arrived with a complicated mixture of gratitude for the stability this approach had provided my family and genuine grief for the personal fulfillment I had largely sacrificed along the way. The seventh thing I understood was that many of my closest friendships throughout my working years had formed almost entirely around professional and family-related contexts, and that I had very few friendships built purely around my own independent, personal interests. Once retirement removed the professional context that had structured most of my adult friendships, I discovered a genuine scarcity of connections built around who I actually was as an individual, separate from my roles as employee, husband, and father, a scarcity that prompted me to begin deliberately seeking friendships rooted in my own rediscovered personal interests instead. The eighth thing I understood was that I had unconsciously equated my own worth for decades almost entirely with how effectively I provided for and served the people who depended on me, leaving very little room for a sense of worth rooted simply in being myself, independent of what I offered to others. This realization arrived with considerable discomfort, as I recognized that retirement, stripping away my primary vehicle for demonstrating this particular form of worth, had left me temporarily uncertain of my own value in a way that a life more balanced between self and others might never have produced so sharply. The ninth thing I understood was that my adult children, once I finally discussed this realization honestly with them, expressed genuine relief rather than any hurt or confusion at learning I intended to spend more of my retirement pursuing my own independent interests rather than remaining entirely available to their needs at every moment. I had feared that prioritizing my own desires more deliberately might be received as a withdrawal of love or diminished devotion. Instead, my children expressed considerable relief at seeing me finally pursue genuine personal fulfillment, having apparently worried themselves, quietly, that I had sacrificed too much of my own life for their sake across the preceding decades. The 10th thing I understood was that certain physical spaces within my own home had been organized almost entirely around everyone else's preferences and needs, with very little consideration given to what I myself might have genuinely wanted from these spaces. I discovered, examining my own home honestly, that I had no genuinely personal space anywhere within it, no room or corner organized purely around my own independent tastes and interests, and creating a small workshop purely for my own use became one of the more meaningful early practical steps I took in reclaiming a portion of my life for myself. The 11th thing I understood was that I had spent decades deferring nearly every significant decision, from vacation destinations to weekend activities, to whatever preference among my family members happened to be loudest or most insistent, rather than ever asserting my own genuine preference with any real confidence. Learning to voice my own preferences plainly, even on relatively minor matters, required considerable deliberate practice after decades of automatic deference, but this small practice gradually restored a sense of my own agency that had grown quite atrophied over so many years of habitual accommodation. The 12th thing I understood was that certain long-held religious or philosophical beliefs I had maintained for decades had actually been inherited almost entirely from my own parents and community, rather than genuinely examined and chosen by me as an independent adult with my own capacity for reflection. Retirement afforded me, for the first time in my adult life, genuine leisure to examine these inherited beliefs honestly, and I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that several of them no longer genuinely reflected my own considered views once I finally gave myself permission to examine them independently rather than simply continuing to accept them by default. The 13th thing I understood was that my own physical health and fitness had been managed for decades almost entirely as a means of remaining capable of providing for my family, rather than ever being pursued as a genuine source of personal enjoyment and pride in its own right. Shifting my approach to exercise and physical activity toward pursuits I genuinely enjoyed, rather than ones merely calculated to maintain provider capacity, transformed what had long felt like an obligatory chore into something I began to look forward to purely for my own pleasure. The 14th thing I understood was that I had spent decades suppressing a genuine desire to travel to certain specific places purely out of my own curiosity, always deferring these particular destinations in favor of family vacation choices better suited to my children's interests during their younger years. Finally, planning a solo trip to a destination I had personally wanted to visit since my 20s, entirely independent of any family consideration, became one of the more significant and meaningful early steps I took in beginning to genuinely live for myself in this new chapter. The 15th thing I understood was that my own sense of humor and personality had grown considerably more subdued and cautious over the decades, shaped largely by a professional environment requiring constant restraint and a family environment requiring consistent, reliable steadiness. Retirement gradually allowed a more playful, spontaneous version of my own personality to resurface, one I recognized, with some surprise, from my own early 20s, before decades of professional and familial responsibility had gradually smoothed over its rougher, more genuine edges. The 16th thing I understood was that I had never actually given myself permission to grieve the personal ambitions and dreams I had quietly set aside decades earlier in favor of the more stable, family-oriented path I ultimately chose. Allowing myself, finally, to genuinely grieve these long-buried alternative paths, rather than continuing to suppress any acknowledgement of this loss entirely, paradoxically freed me to more fully embrace and appreciate the actual life I had built, rather than continuing to carry an unexamined, unprocessed sense of loss silently in the background of my new retirement. The 17th thing I understood was that certain social obligations I continued fulfilling well into retirement, purely out of decades-old habit, no longer genuinely reflected who I had become or what I actually wanted from my remaining years. Releasing several long-standing social commitments that had once served genuine purposes during my working years, but that now persisted purely from inertia, freed considerable time and energy that I gradually redirected toward pursuits and relationships that felt considerably more aligned with my rediscovered, more authentic sense of self. The 18th thing I understood was that my own creative interests, long dismissed throughout my working life as impractical indulgences unsuited to a serious professional, had been quietly waiting for decades for genuine permission to be taken seriously as a legitimate use of my time and attention. Finally allowing myself to pursue creative writing, an interest I had quietly nurtured since childhood but never once taken seriously as an adult, brought a genuine sense of personal fulfillment that my entire career, for all its practical success, had rarely if ever provided me. The 19th thing I understood was that reclaiming my own life did not require me to love my family any less, or to withdraw meaningfully from my role as husband, father, and grandfather, but simply required me to add my own genuine presence back into the equation alongside theirs, rather than continuing to subtract myself entirely from consideration. This distinction, between living generously for others while also genuinely living for myself, versus living exclusively for others at the total expense of my own authentic desires, took me considerable time and reflection to fully understand, but it ultimately became the central insight that reshaped the remainder of my retirement in ways that benefited both myself and everyone I loved. The 20th thing I understood was that certain foods and simple daily pleasures I had quietly denied myself for decades, believing them frivolous indulgences unbecoming of a responsible provider, could finally be genuinely enjoyed without any accompanying guilt once I recognized how small and harmless these particular pleasures actually were. A genuine love of leisurely, unhurried breakfasts, dismissed for decades as an indulgent waste of productive morning time, became one of the simplest and most consistent sources of daily pleasure I discovered once I finally gave myself permission to linger over my coffee without any accompanying sense that I should be doing something more useful instead. The 21st thing I understood was that my own reading habits had narrowed considerably over the decades toward purely practical or professionally relevant material, and that reclaiming a wider, more personally curious reading practice became one of the more quietly restorative changes I made in retirement. I discovered a genuine pleasure in reading purely for curiosity and enjoyment, exploring subjects entirely unrelated to any practical application, a pleasure I had not genuinely indulged since my own college years, decades before career and family obligations had gradually narrowed my reading almost entirely toward the immediately useful. The 22nd thing I understood was that I had spent decades avoiding any activity that risked public failure or embarrassment, having built a professional identity around competence and reliability that left very little room for genuine amateur exploration or acceptable mistakes. Taking up new pursuits in retirement where I was, quite openly, a genuine beginner again, required releasing an old professional identity built entirely around competence, and this release, uncomfortable at first, ultimately became one of the more liberating aspects of finally living more authentically for myself rather than for an audience's ongoing approval. The 23rd thing I understood was that certain long-postponed conversations with old friends about subjects that genuinely interested me personally, rather than subjects I assumed would interest them, revealed relationships considerably richer and more mutually engaging than I had previously realized was possible. Allowing my own genuine curiosities and interests to more openly guide my conversations, rather than continuing to default entirely to subjects I assumed others wanted to discuss, deepened several friendships in ways that surprised me considerably given how many decades these particular relationships had already existed. The 24th thing I understood was that I had spent decades assuming my own retirement would naturally mirror my father's, adopting many of his particular retirement habits and routines simply because they were familiar, without ever genuinely questioning whether they actually suited my own distinct temperament and interests. Recognizing that I had unconsciously inherited an entire retirement template from my father, rather than genuinely designing my own retirement around my own actual preferences, allowed me to deliberately reconsider which of these inherited habits genuinely served me and which I had simply adopted by default, without ever examining them independently. The 25th thing I understood was that giving myself permission to change my mind about long-held plans and decisions, even ones I had committed to for years, became an essential part of genuinely living for myself rather than remaining rigidly bound to decisions made by an earlier version of myself who no longer fully represented who I had become. I had planned for years to relocate to a particular retirement community purely because this had long been the assumed plan, only to recognize, once I finally examined the decision honestly in light of my rediscovered interests, that remaining in my current home actually suited my newly reclaimed sense of self considerably better than the old, unexamined plan ever had. And the 26th thing, the final lesson I want to leave you with today, is this: retirement did not create the emptiness I felt that first Monday morning. It simply removed the busy structure that had allowed me to avoid noticing, for over 4 decades, how much of my own genuine self I had quietly set aside along the way. For most of my working life, I believed that a full, meaningful life simply meant successfully meeting everyone else's expectations of me. I finally understood, sitting at that kitchen table on my first free morning, that a genuinely full life requires including your own authentic voice somewhere within that equation, not as an act of selfishness, but as the honest completion of a life that had, for far too long, left out one genuinely important person from its careful, loving considerations. My friends, I want to be honest with you that reclaiming this lost portion of myself has not been a simple or entirely comfortable process, even years into my retirement. I still occasionally catch myself automatically deferring to what I imagine others would prefer, before pausing to genuinely ask what I myself actually want. Old patterns, practiced faithfully across 4 decades, do not dissolve overnight simply because I have finally named them clearly. But the practice itself, however imperfect and ongoing, has brought a genuine richness to my remaining years that I had not experienced since long before I first began organizing my entire life around everyone else's needs and expectations. I think often of that first Monday morning, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee slowly growing cold, genuinely uncertain what I wanted to do with my newly unstructured time. I understand now that this uncertainty, however uncomfortable it felt in the moment, was actually a genuine gift rather than a problem requiring urgent resolution. It was the first honest question I had allowed myself to ask in decades, a question that had been patiently waiting, unasked, throughout my entire working life, for a moment finally quiet enough to be genuinely heard. I want to share one further reflection before we close, something that took me longer to arrive at than any of the individual realizations I have already described. I have come to believe that my own father, whose expectations quietly shaped so many of my earlier decisions, likely experienced this exact same emptiness in his own retirement, though he never once spoke of it to me directly. He passed only 6 years into his own retirement, and looking back now, I recognize in his own restless, somewhat aimless final years a version of the same disorientation I felt that first Monday morning at my kitchen table. I wonder now how differently his own final chapter might have unfolded had he possessed the language and permission I eventually found for myself, a possibility that has made me considerably more determined to share this particular reflection as widely and honestly as I can, in case it reaches even one person still in time to spare them a similar unspoken emptiness. If you are watching this today, whether already retired or approaching this particular transition yourselves, and you recognize this same pattern of having organized your life almost entirely around everyone else's needs and expectations, I want you to know that noticing this pattern, however uncomfortable the noticing itself may feel, is not a betrayal of the people you have loved and served so faithfully across so many years. It is simply an honest invitation to finally include yourself, genuinely and without guilt, in the remaining chapters of a life you have already given so generously to everyone else around you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize your own particular version of this pattern, and gives you permission to finally ask, perhaps for the first time in decades, what you yourself genuinely want from the years still ahead of you. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Continue loving the people who depend on you, but finally, gently, add your own authentic voice back into the conversation as well. And trust that it is genuinely, truly not too late to begin living at least a portion of your remaining years for yourself. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay generous, stay honest, and remember, a life fully lived includes your own voice among all the others you have so faithfully served. Thank you for watching.